Hi, welcome back to Humanistic Psychology here at the University of West Georgia. This video will be the sixth one in a series where we'll be focusing on the work of Carl Rogers, and more specifically on his most famous book, On Becoming a Person, and more specifically yet, on Chapter 5 out of that book. But let's take a second or two to more or less remind ourselves of the basic structure of what we're doing in the sequence of these videos. So basically we started out with videos that are more or less about Carl Rogers' very general view of life, and as we've been going through chapter after chapter, it's been focusing ever more intently on his view of psychotherapy more specifically. Okay, so in chapter 5 we find ourselves looking at actual transcripts of Carl Rogers working with a particular client. In chapter 5, all of the transcripts are with the very same client, so that you can get a sense for how he responds to what the client says. So we're at pretty much the level of basic responses, basic sentences and words at this point. So but to help you make sense of chapter 5, I want to talk a little bit about two important dimensions of Rogerian psychotherapy. Rogerian is just the adjectival form of his name, so Carl Rogers, Rogerian psychotherapy, okay? And those two dimensions are going to have to do with its reflective nature and also its non-directive nature. Okay, so one thing that let's look at the dimension of reflection first. One thing you might notice right off as you look at these transcripts is the extent to which Carl Rogers is kind of saying back to the client what the client just got done saying in kind of an odd way. And this is more or less characteristic of Rogerian therapy. In fact, little sidebar moment, one of the oldest and perhaps most famous attempts to emulate human linguistic capacities via computer. So an early AI project had to do with emulating Rogerian therapy. And the reason why is because in Rogerian therapy, the responses are so much modeled on what the person just got done saying. But at any rate, end of sidebar moment, Rogerian therapy for sure is very reflective. So the therapist is reflecting back to the client in a way, part of what the client just got done saying. Now the first obvious thing is probably, well, gee, that doesn't sound like that could be terribly helpful to the client. After all, isn't the therapist's job to say back to the client something that the client does not already know? I mean, that's got to be the thing that's going to be helpful, right? And simply to reiterate more or less what the client just got done saying, how could that possibly be helpful with respect to this holistic vision of human transformation that he has in mind? Now, here's the trick to that. The reason why there's this emphasis on reflection is that for the most part when we speak, we don't actually know what we're saying. Surprise! The reason why I say surprise is because most of the time we assume that we do. But the fact is that we're aware of only the surface layers of what we're saying, but not really the psychological depth of what we're saying. So the reflecting back to the client has to do with reflecting some measure of that psychological depth, okay? And kind of the shocking thing is the realization that we know only a tiny fraction. It's sort of like, a iceberg, or, how ice floats in water. I think it's, like 1/9 or something like that of the ice is above the water, and 8/9 is below the water, something like that. Don't quote me on the ratio, but it's something close to that. Well, we're aware of only about 1/9 of what we say, and 8/9 of it is below the water of our awareness. So it's reflecting back that 8/9, okay, that region of psychological depth. Okay, so I said a second ago that in Rogerian therapy, the therapist reflects back only part of what the client's saying. So it's not like the therapist is acting like some kind of therapeutic stenographer and writing everything down or remembering everything and then sort of disgorging all of that back to the client. Instead, the therapist is going to be reflecting back only a very select part of what the client is saying. And the first sort of, we're going to describe this in terms of sort of paring away all the possible things a therapist could reflect back. So the first thing is the therapist reflects back the psychologically important stuff only, for the most part. Okay, so the reflecting back is about the psychological import of what the client is saying. All right, so example, let's say your client is saying, you know, the other day we were out in the car and we got a flat tire and we had to change a flat tire and it started to rain and we were really miserable. Okay, so the therapist would not be reflecting back something like, yeah, the other day you were driving down the road and you had a flat tire and it started to rain and it made you real miserable. The psychologically important part of that is that right now the client is remembering that particular scenario. Okay, so a response much more toward the psychological would be, right now you're remembering how it was that you had a flat tire and it started to rain. Right now you're remembering that story. That's the psychologically important part. You know, all the other details about, well, what kind of car was it? Or, you know, did you have a spare? Or, like, did your jack work? Like something like that. Like, that doesn't matter with respect to psychotherapy. It might matter with respect to getting your car fixed, but not with respect to getting your mind fixed. Okay? You know, so the reflection back is the psychologically important stuff only. In other words, what the client is thinking, feeling, perceiving, especially in the here and now. So in that example, in a session, the client is remembering in the here and now that story. That's the psychologically important part. Right now, you're remembering that story. What is it about remembering that story that makes it important to remember right now? Okay, and maybe you can start to hear it, that starts to sort of cut into the psychological terrain a little bit more deeply than, you know, well, did you have a spare? You know, something like that. All right. So you're not reflecting back all the sort of ephemera, as it were, all of the external factual details of what the client is saying. You focus on the psychological stuff, especially in the here and now, and more specifically yet, so we're sort of tunneling down to the core of this, the stuff that has to do with suffering and pain. Why that? Because that's mostly what therapy is about, is suffering and pain, dealing with suffering and pain. Okay, so let's connect the dots, okay, over the last couple minutes. So Rogerian psychotherapy is very reflective. Why? Because for the most part, it's about getting us in touch with the reality we're actually living out. And the fact is that when we speak, we're only very fractionally in touch with what we're actually saying, and also only fractionally in touch with the reality of whatever that happens to be. Consequently, the therapist reflects back the psychologically important stuff for the most part, rather than all of the details, and especially the psychological stuff in the here and now, and more specifically yet, especially the psychological stuff in the here and now that has to do with pain and suffering. Okay, connecting the dots for you. All right, so second dimension, non-directive. Okay, so I'm going to put some links in the description of this video to a very famous videotape session of Carl Rogers working with a woman whose name is Gloria. It's a very famous record, and part of the, I guess, the oeuvre, as it were, of Carl Rogers. And if you've been through a course like this one at some point, you ought to be able to claim that you saw at least part of the famous Gloria video. So I'm going to put a link there. Anyhow, if you watch that video, actually I'm going to put several links because it's all chopped up. If you watch that video, one thing you'll notice almost in the beginning of the session is like how Carl Rogers resists Gloria's attempt to get him to tell her how to deal with her daughter. Okay, so the client comes in and makes a very specific and explicit request for advice about how to tell her daughter about her sex life, in essence, okay, right? And if you watch the video, notice how Carl Rogers doesn't answer her question, doesn't give her advice, and she does this several times in the video, by the way. So that is more or less representative of this non-directive dimension of Rogerian therapy. For the most part, the therapist resists the client's demands for things like answers, like, tell me how to live my life, won't you? Or advice, which is basically sort of a nicer way of saying the same thing. Tell me how to live my life, won't you? Okay, now why is it that Rogerian therapy isn't particularly about giving advice, not even good advice, okay? Instead, it's going to be about this reflective activity, all right? So why is giving advice not part of this? Well, here's the reality of advice, and maybe you've noticed this in your own life. 9+ times out of 10, when people receive good advice, they end up doing what they want anyhow. 9+ times, probably 96 times out of 100. When people ask for and even receive good advice, they end up doing what they want anyhow. Okay, so the reality is that when we ask for advice, for the most part, what we're really looking for is a confirmation of what we want to do anyhow. And if we don't get that confirmation, we'll find a way of justifying, in one way or another, what it is we've wanted to do all along. So the upshot of all that is that, well, you know, advice doesn't really help people change. It doesn't really help people transform their lives. The biggest thing it does is just confirm the way they already think and what they already desire, you know. So if you've ever sort of noticed this in your regular, not necessarily a clinical relationship, but your everyday relationship, well, so-and-so asked me for advice and I gave him pretty good advice and then he went and did the opposite thing. It's like, yeah, that is not the exception. That's the rule. For the most part, that's what we do with good advice, is ignore it. Okay? Good advice doesn't matter, because it's only when we really discover for ourselves what the right response to life is that it'll be deep enough and powerful enough to prompt us to change. It's only when we discover our own answers in our own way. See, someone can give you the damn key to your entire human existence, and it won't really matter. You won't really do anything with it unless you discover that key for yourself. It doesn't matter if the therapist is right or not. If the client's not ready to take it in, the client will find a way of ignoring it. It doesn't matter how good the advice is. It doesn't matter how accurate the key to your existence is, right? Because human transformation isn't about that in the first place. It's about other things. Another way of saying the same thing is, for the most part, human transformation is not necessarily a rational process, right? There are deeper dynamics at play. You know, Blaise Pascal once famously opined that the heart has its own reasons that reason knows not of. That's from a work called Pensées, okay? French thoughts, all right? So the heart has its own reasons that reason knows not of. And for the most part, we live according to the dictates of our hearts and our desires and things like that. And reason's job, for the most part, is to provide an ex post facto justification for what we want to do anyhow. All right, so that may be a deflationary remark for you, and it definitely is a way of contradicting the way Hollywood presents psychotherapy most of the time, because most of the time the way it's portrayed is, well, you got to give good advice. Yeah. Good advice is eminently ignorable about 97% of the time. All right, so, okay, just scanning through your notes for a second, because only when the client discovers his or her own unique answers does therapy become genuinely transformative. All right, so when the therapist and the client get to the important moment, hopefully in a session, it tends to produce a really strange atmosphere when people are transforming in a deep way, transforming their lives. This is not a vanilla moment. It's a powerful, uncanny type moment, and it feels overwhelming, not just to the client. It's obviously overwhelming because the client's way of being is being itself overwhelmed, okay? But it's also overwhelming for the therapist a lot of the time, and you have to be able to get used to it over time, as in your training, hopefully that happens, that you get used to being with people when they're in the roiling storm of transformation and weathering that storm with them and not being too freaked out by it and all of that kind of stuff. Another thing, if you watch the videos, you'll probably notice is that the therapist always checks with the client to make sure that the interpretation, the response back, is correct. Okay, and if you watch the videos, you'll see Carl Rogers doing this several times. He'll give a response and then say, "Is that really right?" And he lets the client correct him. And this is another thing that strikes people as odd very often about Rogerian therapy. It's like, well, damn, shouldn't he know whether he's right or not? And the answer is no, not actually, because the therapist is not the expert in any particular client's life. What the therapist's expertise is about is a willingness to accompany people where they need to go. All right? So because the therapist is not already the expert in the client's life, the therapist needs to find out about it, all right, as therapy proceeds. The therapist is always checking with the client, make sure that the interpretation is right. So in a way, if you want to see it this way, the client is the one who's leading the session. The client is going where the client needs to go, and the therapist's job is that of facilitation or accompaniment, something like that. But in a sense, it's the client that's leading the session, because the client is the only one who really knows where the client needs to go and when the client needs to go there. Okay? So once again, this is a way of deflating, some ideas, some common sort of Hollywood type ideas about what therapy is, because very often therapists are portrayed as sort of the experts in the client. And it's no, the client is, if there's anyone who's an expert in the client, it would be the client. And often the client is not even an expert in the client. No one's an expert in the client. So it's not about expertise. It's about companionship along a transformative road. Okay, so those are the two big dimensions. So reflective and non-directive. Okay, now there's a third element I want to talk about out of chapter 5, and you'll see this also if you watch the videos. So silence, the importance of silence in Rogerian therapy. So remember a second ago or a few minutes ago I was saying, hopefully the therapist and client get to this weird, uncanny, overwhelming moment of transformation where someone's perceptual field is being pretty radically altered, right, by way of therapy. What the therapist is supposed to reflect back at that point is silence, because usually what happens with clients when that's happening is they run out of words. Okay, they're not talking anymore, and they're just hanging on for the ride, because it's like weird and unsettling and uncanny, and you don't know what's going to happen and so on. So the therapist's job is to respond with silence when that's happening. Why? Because it's important for the therapist not to distract from that process of transformation. And you may think, well, that seems pretty obvious. Yeah, but the thing is, most people have to learn not to distract from that process, because it's a very human thing, especially in Western culture, to be somewhat uncomfortable with silence. All right? Like most of us are pretty uncomfortable with silence. And it takes a special act to become comfortable with it. All right? So when they reach the moment of intense transformation, the therapist's job is to shut up. Okay? Let it happen. Let it happen. Don't distract from it. Here's some ways that therapists, especially in their early training, will distract from it. They'll, even if they are able to resist the temptation to just blurt out some sentence, they'll like cough. They'll move an arm, something like that. Lick their lips, Or another thing that'll happen is the therapist will all of a sudden, because the therapist is uncomfortable, will start thinking about something aside from the therapy. All right, like after this, I'm going to have like a pizza. It's going to taste really good. I can't wait to get to it. What's happening there? The therapist is in pizza world. The therapist is not with the client. Okay. It's important to stay with your client, even when it's not easy to stay with your client. Okay, so silence can be one of those things, and you got to get used to it. Usually in training, when I was training, they would not only have us make transcripts of our sessions, but we had to measure the silences. So if there was a silence, you had to say 16 seconds of silence right here. And I'll tell you what, you can find out how long 16 seconds of your life can be, like when you're a beginner in therapy. Like 16 seconds can seem like a pretty damn long time when you're in this kind of silence. All right, so you have to become a master of silence, as it were, to be a therapist. Like the therapeutic uses of silence are very important, and at first it doesn't seem like it should be that way. No, the therapist should just keep jibber-jabbering the entire time. No, bad strategy. Bad strategy. Okay, so you have to learn. Most of us have to learn to be in silent presence with each other, sometimes for long periods, like even several minutes or longer, possibly even, and not to be thinking about the pizza you're going to have or whatever, or the party you went to last weekend, or because that's a way of you running away from what you're uncomfortable with. Okay, that's not you being in the service of the client. That's you trying to escape. Okay, so you have to sort of work through your own little issues a little bit. Well, guess what? A lot of therapy is about that. Okay, so at this point in the class, we're right between chapters 5 and 7. Usually what I do is I show these old school videos of Carl Rogers working with Gloria, and also there are two other videos in that same series also with Gloria to provide some contrast. So Fritz Perls, who is a Gestalt therapist working with Gloria, and also Rational-Emotive Therapy with Albert Ellis, also working with Gloria. Okay, so I show most of the Rogers one, and then about 10 or 12 minutes, let's say, of the other two, just to give you guys, the students, an idea of something to contrast it with. And there's sort of two purposes to that. One is to let you know that, hey, there's a lot of different schools of psychotherapy out there, and they can vary a lot in how they're conducted. And implicitly, the question is for you young people who are interested in psychology, like which one should you gravitate toward? And a lot of that has to do with realizing the kind of person that you are, and what gifts you have to offer other human beings and the world more generally, and so on. So there's a lot of exploration that needs to go on at this point in your young process. Like, start to wonder what kind of person you really are, and what kind of values you really have, and how you really think about life, and what you think the fundamental motive dynamisms of life are all about, and how you can link up into them. So you may think that, well, those are all questions for the doctoral level. Yeah, they're questions at the doctoral level, but I would say they're also questions relevant to your undergraduate level. So as you watch the videos that I'm going to put links to, like, wonder in the back of your mind, like, are you really sort of constructed to be a Rogerian type therapist? Or who knows, maybe you're a much more sort of confrontational, sort of pugnacious type therapist like Fritz Perls, or maybe, Rational-Emotive Therapy, it feels very cerebral. So when you watch Albert Ellis, who is, of course, the great progenitor of Rational-Emotive Therapy, if you're sort of more rationally constructed, well, maybe that's more your bailiwick, than Rogerian therapy. And by the way, if you discover in this course that something like, oh, I just learned in humanistic psychologist, I'm definitely not cut out to be a Rogerian therapist. Good, great, wonderful. That's a positive learning. Half of learning in life is learning what you don't want to do. Okay, usually we underrate that. Like, you discover something and you figure out that, oh, I don't want to go down that road. That's a positive learning. But no matter what, take a look at the videos, and we'll see you in the next video where we're going to take up chapter 7, which is a relatively long chapter. But till then, have a good one.